Proceduralism was at one point something of a buzzword within the 3D software industry. As with all buzzwords or concepts, in time people came to take the concept for granted, and now all 3D software features a procedural workflow to one degree or another. But what exactly does proceduralism mean within a 3D workflow? For those new to the 3D industry, the term may be confusing, and indeed many old hands still do not have a strong grasp on the concept, or at least when it comes to using it in production. On this DVD, we'll be looking at a number of concepts that combine together to form what most people today consider proceduralism. Of course, the concept is a broad one. On one 3D package, it will mean one thing, and on another, something different again. We'll also take a brief look on this DVD at some of the workflow in Houdini and Maya to see how these packages handle their own flavor of proceduralism. So let's briefly look at what we'll be covering on this DVD before we make a start with Chapter 1. In Chapter 1 we'll actually be looking at what have we been discussing here. What exactly is proceduralism? I'll be running through the basic concepts of the workflow that lies behind proceduralism and why it's such an important thing to understand when working in pretty much any 3D software these days. In Chapter 2 we'll be looking at common approaches to proceduralism. And to demonstrate that a little bit more clearly, what I've actually done is I've come up with a basic problem that we can solve procedurally, and we look at how we'll actually solve that problem in 3ds Max first, then in Maya, and then in Houdini. And by looking at the three different packages, we can get a better idea of exactly what proceduralism is and how there's such a varied way of actually tackling the same problem within three different pieces of software. And you can see that there's a wide variety of ways of tackling the same kind of problem. In Chapter 3 we'll be looking at the stack, and in this case we'll be just looking at the theory of the stack. What does the stack represent? How can we work with the stack? How do we build up systems using the stack so we can build our own procedural objects using modifiers and using instancing and so on. In Chapter 4 we'll be looking at instancing and referencing, and this is a pretty profound concept, and it's used again across 3D software. 3ds Max actually has one of the best examples of instancing in that it does actually work. It's stable, and you can use it productively in production. It's not just something which will be used with nodes such as objects. It can also be used with smaller elements such as modifiers, and it can also be used with controllers as well. So it's actually quite an important topic to get your head around. In Chapter 5 we'll be looking at base objects. In 3ds Max we have various types of geometry that we can work with. We can work with NURBS, we can work with editable meshes, we can work with splines, we can work with patch models and so forth. And each one of these geometries is known as a base geometry type. And you can actually convert to these base geometry types using the right-click menu and quad menus, but you can also do it procedurally using modifiers. And we'll be looking at how we can actually carry out those things in that chapter. In Chapter 6 we'll be looking at the stack, and we'll be looking how we can actually work with the stack, what the different elements of it are, how we can move modifiers around within the stack, how we can instance nodes, move them around, we can turn nodes off, we can make them active only at render time, only in the viewport, and so on and so forth. In Chapter 7 we'll be actually looking at the modifiers themselves, and what I've done in this chapter is I've actually looked at the basic categories that the modifiers are subdivided into, and I very quickly run through the basic functionality of the modifiers in those groups. Now there's a lot of modifiers, and there's certainly not enough time in this DVD to run through every single one of them, and I don't think it's necessarily an important thing to do on a training DVD. So use this as just a rough guide as to what the modifiers can do, and if you're interested in any particular modifier, I'd probably recommend actually reading the online help in that to actually get some more insight into what each modifier does. In Chapter 8 we'll be looking at topological dependency, and again this is a very important concept when working in a procedural manner, and this deals with the issue where one modifier will work on the mesh which is passed to it, and it will identify certain parts of the mesh and apply its modification to those parts. Then if you go down further in the stack and you make a modification below, that can then pass a different selection of geometry to their object, and actually that can change its end result drastically, and this is called topological dependency, and that's something we'll be looking at in depth in that particular chapter. In Chapter 9, our last chapter, we'll be looking at experimentation. How can we use proceduralism in our day-to-day workflow? Well, this chapter actually shows how you can try out different modeling ideas on a model and not have to commit to anyone in particular. You can have those live in a file at one time, and you can just turn off modifiers and turn modifiers on to see different variations on a model. And we'll also have a look how we can actually use the procedural system in the stack to actually rectify a problem that we did accidentally on a model. In this case, using a small selection of vertices and then passing those up to a modifier, and using that small selection to actually fix a problem in our mesh. So as you can see, we have a great deal of material to run through on this DVD, so let's make a start in chapter 1.